in which we continue on with the actual anatomy of the GI tract, as well as discuss some of the accessory organs as we run into them. We are going to start with the mouth. This section will only be about the oral cavity. And when we're done with that, this section will be over. In the next section, we'll talk about the pharynx and larynx and esophagus. Before we get to the mouth, we're going to talk about, or at least mention, each of the major structures of the GI tract. So it is a muscular tube that's approximately 25-ish to 33-ish feet long. Major organs in order and their functions in order will be the oral cavity, fancy word for mouth. Mechanical processing occurs here. Please remember, when we talk about mechanical processing, we are talking about taking large particles and breaking them down into smaller ones. We are not breaking chemical bonds, so therefore we are not releasing energy. We're going to mix the food that we mechanically process by teeth and tongue movement and moisten it and mix it with saliva. The food will move into the pharynx, which is going to propulse food into the esophagus. And the esophagus is basically just a conduit to get materials into the stomach. The major function of the stomach is as a temporary storage tank for food. Let me repeat that. The major function of the stomach is as a temporary storage tank for food. Some chemical breakdown and some mechanical processing also occurs there, and there are several other very important functions of the stomach, but the major function is as a temporary storage tank for food. The small intestine is the hotbed of activity because that is where the majority of chemical digestion as well as absorption of nutrients will occur. And the large intestine is primarily responsible for production, storage, and elimination of fecal matter. The large intestine's major function is for production, storage, and elimination of fecal matter. So here we are at our oral cavity. Everybody knows what the mouth looks like, right? It's going to be surrounded by the lips, the cheeks, the hard and soft palate, and contain the tongue. The anterior opening is actually the oral orifice. It is going to be lined by stratified squamous epithelium, that oral mucosa. The areas that are exposed to severe abrasion will be keratinized, so the superior tongue surface, the hard palate are all going to be heavily imbued with keratin for protection. There will be a thinner, non-keratinized lining along the cheeks, the lips, and the inferior portion of the tongue. That thin mucosal inferior, really rapid absorption of lipid-soluble drugs, for example, nitroglycerin. Nutrients are not absorbed here. So let's stop and talk about the so-called digestion of carbohydrates and lipids that begins here. It really doesn't. What happens is this. The mouth is going, or the oral cavity, the salivary glands are going to secrete salivary amylase, which will start starch digestion, and lingual lipase, which means that there is an enzyme that is added to fats in the mouth, but very little digestion of carbohydrates happens in the mouth, and no digestion of lipids does. We just add lingual lipase to the fats that you eat. Food is not in your mouth long enough for any digestion to really occur. You chew it, and then you swallow it. So it's not there long enough for real digestion to occur, particularly of fats. There you are. That's what it looks like. We're going to talk about the hard palate, it's a soft palate, the uvula. We've already mentioned the tonsils when we talked about the immune system and the lymphatic system. And we'll talk a little bit more about the tongue, and we'll mention a few of these other structures. Hard palate, palatine bones, palatine process of the maxilla. It is slightly corrugated, and that will help create friction with the tongue. Soft palate is going to be basically mostly skeletal muscle. It's going to be important to close off the nasopharynx when you swallow, and you're going to have that little projection, the uvula, which is going to stick downward from the free edge. The tongue itself is skeletal muscle. Actually really important for a number of reasons, which include flipping the food over and over and over so it is really exposed to your teeth while you're chewing. It is going to help with the formation of the bolus, which is the small blob of food that you swallow that moves along the pharynx and larynx, down the larynx and into the esophagus. It is crucial for the initiation of swallowing. You totally need it for speech, and it's going to be important for taste. We'll have muscles that will either change the shape of the tongue or alter its position so you can flip food over and over. And you have a small attachment known as the lingual frenulum, which is going to allow the tongue to be connected to the floor of the mouth. The superior surface are going to contain what are known as papillae. There are several different types. The filiform give the tongue its roughness and help provide friction. They don't contain taste buds. The fungiform are reddish. They kind of look like mushroomish. They are all over the tongue. They will contain some taste buds. The valate is this V-shaped row in the back of the tongue. It does contain taste buds. And the foliate are on the lateral aspects of the tongue, and they will also contain taste buds that are going to function primarily in the youths of our world, infants and children. And there you go. That's what they look like. So the salivary glands are going to be really important accessory organs of the digestive system. No surprise that they produce saliva. They are going to lie outside of the oral cavity, and there are three pairs that you need to know. Remember, they are bilateral, so they are paired. The parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual glands. There are also a bunch of minor salivary glands, and they are all over the oral cavity, and they sort of slightly augment the amount of saliva that you produce. But the three biggies are the ones you need to know: the parotid glands, the submandibular glands, and the sublingual glands. Parotid gland is going to be anterior and slightly inferior to the ear. It is external to the masseter. The parotid duct is going to open into the oral vestibule next to the second upper molar. If you have inflammation of those glands, you have mumps. Submandibular glands are going to be medial to the body of the mandible. You will have a duct for those guys that will open at the base of the lingual frenulum to secrete saliva. And last but certainly not least will be the sublingual glands, which will be anterior to the submandibular glands under the tongue. And there are, I don't know, 10, 12 ducts that are going to open up and secrete saliva into the floor of the mouth. And this shows you the position of the sublingual gland and the submandibular gland and the parotid gland. You should be able to identify those on diagram. Don't worry about having to try to identify the diagram on, or the micrograph on the right. But you should be able to tell me that that big giant gland that is just anterior and kind of runs slightly inferior to the ear is the parotid gland. And then the submandibular gland and the sublingual glands, you should be able to name those. Saliva itself is mostly water. seriously, no surprise there. Every single fluid in the body is mostly water. It is vaguely acidic. It's going to contain a whole bunch of electrolytes. We already mentioned salivary amylase and lingual lipase. Mucin is a form of mucus. What a surprise, more mucus. It will contain some metabolic wastes, which include urea and uric acid. It is also going to contain some antibodies, primarily IgA, lysosomes, defensins, and a cyanide derivative that helps protect against pathogens that might try to invade. What does it do? I would know this list if I were you, because one of the questions on the practical that you might get is give at least 3 functions of saliva, and you need to tell me this. It helps cleanse the mouth. Because of the components that we just discussed, it does help keep the mouth clean. It is going to dissolve food chemicals for taste. Remember, when you are trying to taste anything, you need to dissolve the food particles in order for those taste receptors to work correctly. It's going to moisten food. It's going to compact that into a bolus. It does begin the digestion of starch with specifically salivary amylase, and it does add lingual lipase to food. In addition to that, it is going to lubricate the food that you are swallowing so it can move more easily down through the conduits that it needs to move through to get to the stomach. When you swallow that compacted ball of food, it is now known as a bolus. A bolus, B-O-L-U-S. This is the TC3 pool. I used to swim here several times a week. I miss it terribly. I really like to swim. And I have this picture here, not only because I like to swim, but because you produce 1 to 2 liters of saliva during your lifetime, which can fill a pool. So you can fill a pool with saliva during your lifetime. Perhaps not an Olympic-sized pool like this one, but you do produce enough saliva in your lifetime to fill a good-sized swimming pool. Sure enough, you're going to produce between 1 and 2 liters of saliva a day. Intrinsic glands need to work to basically keep the mouth moist continually. If you have dry mouth, you're probably going to start to have problems with cavities because the lysosomes, etc., in the saliva helps kill bacteria and prevent tooth decay. The 3 major salivary glands or pairs of salivary glands that you need to know are going to be activated by the PNS when ingested food starts to stimulate chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors that you find in the mouth, and also what's known as the salivatory nuclei in the brain stem is going to send along impulses, shooting along parasympathetic fibers in cranial nerve 7 and cranial nerves 9. Really strong sympathetic stimulation will inhibit salivation, and you will end up with dry mouth. So if your mouth goes dry when you're frightened, that's why. The teeth are going to be important because they are going to tear and grind food and get it prepared for digestion through mechanical processing. There are primary and permanent dentition's teeth formed by about the age of 21. There are going to be 20 deciduous teeth, which are going to erupt between 6 months of age and 24 months of age. The roots get reabsorbed, the teeth fall out, sort of ages 6 to age 12. As those permanent teeth develop, you end up with 32 permanent teeth. All but the third molars are generally end by the time you leave adolescence, and the third molars may erupt sort of from age 17 to age 25, or may not erupt at all. And that's that for the mouth. Stay tuned for more fun with the digestive system as we move on to the pharynx, the larynx, and the esophagus in the next section.